Operation Barbarossa, the fatal decision that changed World War II, June 21st, 1941. 2,000 miles of frontier, and not a single sound. From the freezing mists of the Baltic down to the scorched Black Sea coast, Europe was holding its breath. If you were standing there on that invisible line, the air felt different, heavy, charged with something you couldn't see but you could definitely feel. It was the electricity of a dying world. On one side, the German Wehrmacht, the most efficient professional killing machine ever built by industrial hands. On the other, the Soviet Union, a sleeping giant draped in red, led by Joseph Stalin, a man whose paranoia was the only thing stronger than his iron will. For months, they had played a cynical game of friends under a pact signed in ink. They had divided Poland, traded oil for machinery, and smiled for the cameras. But as the sun went down on that final evening of peace, that ink was already brittle. It was dry, ready to be burned in the largest conflagration history had ever seen. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was pacing the halls of the Reich Chancellery. He didn't see a nation across that border. He saw a rotten edifice. He told his generals that one single decisive kick to the front door would bring the whole house down. He believed the Slavic people were fundamentally inferior, and their state was a fragile shell waiting to be shattered. He was about to deliver that kick with 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, and the full screaming weight of the Luftwaffe. He promised his soldiers they would be home before the leaves fell. It was a promise built on pure hubris. And Stalin? He was paralyzed in the Kremlin. Even with his own spies like Richard Sorge screaming the truth at him, even as British intelligence sent frantic warnings, Stalin chose to believe a lie. He saw the German tanks moving to the border and called it a provocation to force a diplomatic deal. He told his men not to fire back, fearing it would give Hitler the excuse he needed. He gave Hitler the only thing a conqueror truly needs, a head start. At 3:15 a.m., the world broke. Thousands of German guns fired at once in a single earth-shaking roar. It wasn't just noise, it was a physical blow to the crust of the planet. Hundreds of miles away, people felt the vibration in their floors. Before the sun was even up, the Soviet Air Force was a memory. Thousands of planes were burned into the runways, destroyed before their pilots could even reach the cockpits. The Luftwaffe owned the sky, and they used that power to turn every road, bridge, and rail line into a graveyard. The invasion surged forward in 3 great waves. Army Group North tore through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group South pushed into the fertile plains of Ukraine, aiming for the grain and coal of the east. But the center, the Iron Fist under von Bock, had one target: Moscow. The Soviet border guards didn't stand a chance. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and cut off from their commanders in the first hour. Yet they fought with a desperate, suicidal bravery that the Germans had never seen in France or Poland. At Brest Fortress, a small garrison held out for weeks in the cellars, fighting with bayonets and even bricks long after they were surrounded. They were the first crack in the myth of the rotten edifice. But for now, the Blitzkrieg seemed unstoppable. Not a war, but a race. German panzer divisions moved so fast that the infantry couldn't keep up. They bypassed entire armies, leaving them trapped in massive pockets. By July, the German high command was laughing. General Halder wrote in his diary that the war was won in 2 weeks. At Minsk and Bialystok, the pincers snapped shut. 300,000 Russians captured in a single heartbeat. It looked like the end of the world for the Soviet Union. But then the land itself started to speak. The roads, the neat paved roads of Europe, simply disappeared. In their place were primitive dirt tracks that turned into blinding dust clouds in the summer heat. This dust was a silent killer. It got into the engines, clogging the precision machinery of the German tanks. It got into the lungs of the men, making every breath a struggle. The German army was a modern beast of steel, but it relied on nearly 1 million horses for its supplies. Those horses started to die first, thousands of them lining the roads like grim milestones. The sheer, mind-boggling scale of the Soviet Union began to swallow the German supply lines whole. For every mile they advanced, the distance back to the railheads grew longer. The Blitzkrieg was stretching, and then it started to snap. And the Russians, they didn't surrender like the Western armies had. Even when surrounded in the great pockets, they fought until the last bullet, then charged tanks with nothing but rocks and bayonets. The supermen of the Wehrmacht were meeting people who simply didn't care about dying. Behind the front lines, Stalin's scorched earth policy left nothing for the invaders. Every grain elevator was burned, every bridge was blown, every factory was dismantled and shipped eastward by rail to the Urals. The Germans were marching into a desert they were building themselves. There was no food, no shelter, and every village well was poisoned. By August, the heat was gone, replaced by a humid, heavy air that hinted at the coming change. Hitler then made a choice that many historians believe cost him the war. He ignored the road to Moscow and sent his panzers south to Kiev. His generals begged him to stay the course, arguing that the fall of the capital would decapitate the Soviet state. But Hitler was a man of maps and resources. He wanted the coal of the Donbass and the wheat of Ukraine. He got his victory. At Kiev, nearly 750,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped. Stalin, in his stubbornness, had forbidden a retreat, handing Hitler his greatest tactical success on a silver platter. By the end of September, over 600,000 Red Army soldiers marched into a captivity that was really just a slow death sentence. It was a victory of unprecedented scale, but it cost Hitler the only thing he couldn't buy with blood: time. The nights were getting colder, the sun was setting earlier every day, the Wehrmacht was tired, their tanks were worn out, their tracks filed down by the grit of the steppe. And the giant was not dead, it was retreating into its own frozen heart. In October, the weather changed with a sudden, cruel finality. The Rasputitsa, the season of the mud, began. The Russian landscape transformed into a bottomless morass of black, viscous sludge. Movement became nearly impossible. Trucks sank to their axles. Tanks just stopped, their engines screaming in the mud until they ran out of fuel. The Blitzkrieg was dead, drowned in a swamp of its own making. Behind the lines, the war was getting even uglier. The Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, were busy carrying out the systematic liquidation of Jews and political officers. This brutality, intended to terrify the population, backfired. It turned every Russian peasant into a partisan. They lived in the woods, ghosts in the forest. They cut the wires. They blew up the rail lines. They killed the stragglers in the night. The war of soldiers had become a war of peoples. Stalin, sensing this, underwent a transformation. He stopped fighting for the Communist Party and started fighting for Mother Russia. He brought back the old Tsarist medals. He reopened the churches, and he invoked the names of the great Russian heroes of the past. And then he called in the Siberians, hard men, born in the ice of the Far East, who knew how to live and kill in the dark. December came and the temperature hit 30 below zero. The German soldiers were still wearing the thin summer tunics they had started with in June. The high command had been so arrogant, so sure of a quick victory, that they hadn't even ordered winter clothing to be shipped to the front. Men were wrapping themselves in stolen rags, newspapers, and women's fur coats just to keep from freezing to death. Their synthetic oil turned into jelly in their engines. Their delicate machine guns froze shut. The Wehrmacht was a summer army, a precision machine trying to survive a Russian winter that had swallowed Napoleon's Grande Armée a century before. By early December, the lead elements of the 2nd Panzer Division reached the suburb of Khimki. German officers could see the gleaming spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars, just 12 miles away. They were at the gates. They were so close they could almost hear the factory whistles of the city, but they were ghosts. Emaciated, frozen men staring at a prize they could never touch. They were at the absolute limit of human endurance. On the morning of December 5th, the white mist of the steppe broke, and out came the Siberians. They came on skis, in white camouflage with the legendary T-34 tanks that didn't care about the cold. It wasn't a battle. It was a release of years of stored-up vengeance. The German line didn't just break, it shattered. For the first time in the entire Second World War, the invincible Wehrmacht was running away, leaving their equipment and their dead in the snow. Operation Barbarossa failed because Hitler mistook a temporary advantage for eternal superiority. He thought his will could beat the geography of a continent. He thought his hate could beat the industrial capacity of a mobilized nation. He was wrong on every count. While he was celebrating victories in the summer, the Soviets were moving over 1,500 factories to the safety of the Urals, ensuring they would eventually outproduce Germany in every category of war. The T-34 tank, with its sloped armor and wide tracks, was a technological shock that the German planners never anticipated. The road to Berlin was now paved in the snow, marked by the bodies of the millions who had fallen. The silence of June was gone forever, replaced by a roar that wouldn't stop until it reached the heart of Germany. Barbarossa wasn't just a military failure. It was the moment the Third Reich signed its own death warrant. It proved that no matter how sharp the sword, it cannot cut through the weight of a land that refuses to die. The myth of the master race was buried in the drifts outside Moscow, and the world realized that the beginning of the end had finally arrived. As the 1941 campaign drew to a close, the cost was finally tallied. Millions of Soviet citizens were dead or in captivity. Entire cities had been wiped from the map, but the Soviet Union remained. It had traded its space for time, its blood for survival. The German soldier, once a proud conqueror, was now a shivering survivor in a frozen wasteland. They had marched 3,000 miles into the east, only to find that the deeper they went, the further they were from victory. Operation Barbarossa remains the defining hubris of the modern age, a testament to the fact that when ideology blinds strategy, the result is always the same: ashes, ice, and a silence that lasts for generations. Please like and subscribe to support more content like this.